Interesting part I want to get into. And it's not like the Supreme Court here gave a full, multi-page written explanation. No, rather, there was an order that was signed by Chief Justice Sharon Kennedy that stated, quote, upon consideration of the jurisdictional memorandum.
Just a door closing. And if you want one image to keep in your mind for this entire case, picture a prison gate controlled by a countdown clock. Not a jury, not a witness, not a new piece of evidence. A clock. Because according to the courts that reviewed this case, everything may have come down to a filing deadline. Before we go deeper into what the documents actually show, make sure you're subscribed to Audit the Case, because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence.
McKenzie Sharilla was just handed another loss. The Ohio Supreme Court declined to hear her appeal of her murder convictions. We're going to try to get to the bottom of why this happened and what it means for her, because she may now be looking at spending the rest of her life behind.
Now, let's back up. McKenzie Sharilla is serving a sentence of 15 years to life after being convicted in connection with a 2022 crash that killed her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and another passenger, Devon Flanagan.
Her appeal once again. I'm going to talk about why I say once again. Remember, she drove a car 100 miles per hour into a building, killing the two passengers, her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and his friend, Davion Flanagan, back on July 31st, 2022. She was found guilty by a judge in a bench trial. Remember, this wasn't in front of a jury. It was in front of a judge. She opted for that in front of a bench trial. She was found guilty of 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, and 1 count of possessing criminal tools. But what is happening?
The facts presented at trial were devastating. Vehicle data showed the car traveling at extremely high speed. The accelerator was fully depressed. There was no meaningful braking before impact. A judge, not a jury, ultimately convicted her of multiple counts, including murder. But the appeal that just died before the Ohio Supreme Court wasn't really about the crash itself. That's the important distinction. It wasn't primarily about guilt. It wasn't primarily about innocence. It was about procedure. And in law, procedure can become destiny. That's the gap at the center of this story. Sharilla's legal team argued that her constitutional rights were violated because trial counsel allegedly failed to properly investigate evidence.
Okay, and let me start with the opening paragraph of her brief. It says, quote, McKenzie Sharilla, who was 17 years old when the car she was driving crashed into a wall at a speed in excess of 80 miles per hour, is serving a life sentence for murdering her 2 passengers. There is medical evidence that McKenzie Sharilla suffered from a pre-existing medical condition that could have caused her to black out while driving. But that evidence was only cursorily referenced at trial because defense counsel, despite being aware of Ms. Sharilla's condition, did not adequately investigate this aspect of the case and did not attempt to secure expert testimony. So look, this is the whole POTS thing, right? The POTS.
Related to a medical condition known as POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. In plain English, the defense theory was that she may have... It wasn't primarily about guilt. It wasn't primarily about innocence. It was about procedure. And in law, procedure can become destiny. That's the gap at the center of this story. Sharilla's legal team argued that her constitutional rights were violated because trial counsel allegedly failed to properly investigate evidence.
Sharilla has insisted that ever since the beginning, she has no memory whatsoever of the crash or the minutes leading up to it, that she and her family have suggested that she has a diagnosis of POTS, a medical condition that can cause dizziness and fainting. They claim Sharilla must have blacked out, which is why she drove off the road. And yes, at trial, there was no official medical diagnosis that was presented. Although Sharilla's mom
experienced a medical event behind the wheel. They argued that expert testimony should have been pursued more aggressively, and they argued that effective representation might have changed the outcome. Now here's where things become complicated, because the courts were not simply deciding whether that argument was persuasive. They were deciding whether they were even allowed to hear it. Different question.
Back now to Sharilla's brief to the Supreme Court, because basically this is the argument that she makes. I had bad lawyers. ineffective assistance of counsel. It's the Sixth Amendment, right? Now, this is where it gets a little procedural, it gets a little specific, but this is the main theme here, and it's important. The main issue about taking this to the Supreme Court is about whether or not she is bringing this post-conviction relief petition too late. Sharilla argues that right now, the only legal way she can bring an ineffective assistance of counsel claim is through this specific petition. And the trial court said, look, you filed it at a time. The 8th District Court of Appeals agreed. They affirmed it. And she makes the argument this appellate court made a mistake. They mistakenly identified the deadline by which I can bring this relief petition. And she says the problem is that this post-conviction relief statute that sets the deadline when you can file it.
Very different consequences. The clock doesn't care. Remember that phrase. The clock doesn't care. According to court filings, Ohio law provides a
prison. That's why the stakes are so high. And Sharilla's team argues it's all about what, quote, trial transcript means, because that's what's used to measure the time by which this petition has to be filed. Under the law, apparently it has to be 365 days after the filing of the trial transcript that you can file this post-conviction relief petition. So this is what she gets into. And she argues that a post-conviction petition is important because it examines whether a defendant's constitutional rights were violated. It's larger. It's not just looking at the trial record. It's looking beyond that. And she says this is all about determining the deadline for when she could file. Quote, competent post-conviction counsel must understand the trial court's record before deciding what issues, if any, can be raised in a post-conviction relief petition. Understanding the record means being familiar with the court proceedings that led to conviction, usually by reading the pertinent transcripts. For that reason, the deadline for filing a
specific deadline for filing a post-conviction petition? Miss the deadline, and the petition can be rejected before the underlying claims are ever fully examined. Sharilla's lawyers argued there was
What's a trial transcript? What's the definition? She makes the argument that a trial transcript, she says this has been a question that's fought in the courts for a long time. There's ambiguity. It's not clear. And she goes through how a bunch of different courts look at it and define it. I'm not going to bore you with all that. Here's the interesting way she looks at it. She says, I think it's more broad than just looking at the actual trial. She says, let's say you have a defendant who is making an argument, is making a challenge in a petition that a defense attorney failed to call an important witness at a pretrial hearing, let's say an evidence suppression hearing. So this is before trial. And then the defendant ends up pleading no contest to the charge. The only transcript that's available is from that suppression hearing. There's no trial. Are you saying there's no trial transcript? No. Is that fair? Does that mean you can't pursue a relief petition?
ambiguity in calculating that deadline? The state argued there wasn't.
If your attorney made a big mistake, you're out of luck. So what happened in Sharilla's case? Well, basically, Sharilla had first appealed her case in September of 2023, and her lawyer requested all the court records. The main trial court records, they were filed on October 24th, 2023. However, there was a separate, what she says, crucial record, important record from her juvenile court hearing, and that was omitted. It had to be tracked down later. And by law, again, I said she had 365 days to file her next petition. Her new lawyers filed it on October 24th, 2024. So if the 365-day clock started when the main trial records, the trial transcript was filed, they were exactly 366 days late, so 1 day late. But she's making the argument, no, the clock started when the juvenile court records were finally filed. And if that's the case, and we start the clock at that point, I'm on time. Now,
and that disagreement became the battlefield. On one side, Sharilla's attorney said certain records were essential to understanding the case and should affect when the filing clock started. On the other side, prosecutors argued the deadline was straightforward. Trial transcript filed, clock starts. Deadline expires, case closed. What's fascinating is how both sides were talking about constitutional rights while simultaneously arguing over what appears, at first glance, to be paperwork. But that's often how major legal battles work. A constitutional claim may sound enormous. The question of whether it was filed correctly can sound tiny. Yet the tiny question controls whether the enormous question ever gets heard. And that's exactly what happened here. The lower courts rejected Sharilla's argument. Then, the Ohio Supreme Court declined to take the appeal. Now, it's important to understand what that does not necessarily mean. It does not automatically mean the Supreme Court agreed with every argument made by prosecutors. It does not necessarily mean the justices issued a broad ruling on innocence or guilt. It means they declined to hear the appeal. But the practical effect is enormous.
Response was. They say, quote, defendant appellant McKenzie Sharilla drove her vehicle at a high rate of speed into a building, killing her boyfriend and another passenger. Her vehicle's data recorder showed that Sharilla drove more than 95 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone, with the accelerator pedal 100% depressed, never applying the brakes. Sharilla maintained control of the vehicle as it maneuvered a large curve in the road, never veering off the road. She also previously threatened to crash her vehicle while her boyfriend was inside it. Defendant appellant McKenzie Sharilla miscalendared the date that her petition for post-conviction relief was due. The trial transcripts were filed in her direct appeal on October 23, 2023, triggered the 365-day statutory clock to file the petition. She filed the petition on October 24, 2024, which is the same day that many of her exhibits were notarized. Because 2024 was a leap year, Sharilla's petition was late by 1 day. The trial court properly denied her petition as untimely. Realizing the enormity of her error, Sharilla argued on appeal that the 365-day clock did not start until transcript of a probable cause hearing in the juvenile court was filed in the direct appeal on December 15, 2020.
Let's look at the prosecution's position. Prosecutors pointed to evidence introduced at trial that they argued contradicted the medical emergency theory: vehicle data, driving behavior, witness testimony, prior statements. The state argued that
the 8th District Court of Appeals unanimously and correctly rejected this argument. It noted that the statutory phrase trial transcript customarily refers to the record of the adjudicatory proceeding in which guilt was determined, and held that a juvenile probable cause hearing is not a trial. And then they say the 8th District distinguished Sharilla from another case, this Baker case, a case in which there was no trial transcript existed because the defendant pleaded guilty. This case fails to present an issue of public or great general interest, which we talked about before. It concerns only the untimely filing of a post-conviction petition due to the mistake of counsel. For these reasons, the state respectfully asks that this court decline to exercise jurisdiction over this appeal. So basically, they are arguing the trial transcript is about a trial, not...
the evidence overwhelmingly supported the conviction. And they argued something else. They argued that even if the filing deadline feels harsh.
And actually, I thought this was interesting because the prosecution says Sharilla herself admitted that the trial transcript, right? What's the definition? She admitted in her filing the trial transcripts were filed October 23rd, 2023. So she's defining what it is. She's saying this is a trial transcript, distinguishing it from the juvenile court hearing transcripts. And they argue that her constitutional violations claims, they're forfeited because they weren't raised earlier. They say in their brief, I know it may seem harsh to deny a petition to a defendant that's filed 1 day late, but those are the rules. The rules are the rules. And they make the argument that every case she cites for tolling, that was a federal case involving a completely unrelated habeas corpus petition. That's a very different one. Basically, it's about whether your detention is unlawful. And they make the argument that even if an equitable tolling exception existed, Sharilla failed to establish that that exception applied. That her proposition of claims that there's a, quote, substantial reason to believe that if her petition was granted that she would be acquitted. But Sharilla fails to cite or even discuss any of the trial evidence.
Deadlines exist for a reason. The legal system depends on finality. Cases cannot remain open forever. At some point, judgments become judgments. At some point, appeals end. At some point, the process stops. The clock doesn't care. There it is again. And that's exactly the principle prosecutors relied upon. What makes this case so compelling is the collision between two ideas that both carry weight. First, the idea that constitutional claims deserve meaningful review. Second, the idea that legal deadlines must actually mean something. Neither principle is irrational. Neither principle is easy to dismiss. The tension between them is what created this entire fight. And now, we arrive
or the evidence attached to her petition. So those were the arguments, and the Supreme Court of Ohio refused to hear their case, not necessarily saying they sided with the prosecution. I mean, they didn't admit it, but seems that could be very well what happened. Seems very likely because that's what the prosecution asked for, right? The prosecution asked the Supreme Court to decline this appeal. And by the way, we believe this is the second time the Ohio Supreme Court has refused to hear her case. According to Cleveland.com, Sharilla had appealed her conviction. She argued that the prosecution didn't prove the key element of intent, but the 8th District Court of Appeals upheld her conviction, and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case that time too. So what we're talking about here is different. It's a post-conviction relief. It's a little bit different than a standard appeal. It's about alleged constitutional violations. But again, the Supreme Court of Ohio declined.
path forward appears increasingly limited. Which brings us to the ticking clock question. What happens when the legal system reaches a point where every future argument depends not on what happened that night, but on whether any new evidence ever appears? Because once that threshold is crossed, the story stops being about a trial. It becomes a waiting game. A years-long waiting game. A decades-long waiting game. And for someone serving a life jail sentence, that waiting game can define an entire future. Now, let's talk about the irony. Throughout this litigation, the defense has argued that the case does
to hear her case. And that is interesting, by the way, because when Sharilla made her first on-camera interview from behind bars in a documentary on Netflix called The Crash, she said, quote, "I'm big on the no intent. There was no intent whatsoever there. I have excessive amounts of remorse for Dominic, Davion, both of their families. This was not intentional, and I will do everything I can to prove that to the world and the families, and that's it." And I got to say, this is...
The appeal is over. The sentence remains. And the unanswered question is the same one that has followed this case from the beginning. Was this ultimately a case where critical evidence never received the attention it deserved? Or a case where the courts correctly concluded that the evidence had already been tested and the legal process had already run its course? If you want to examine the record yourself, start with the Ohio Supreme Court docket filings and the 8th District Court of Appeals opinion discussing the post-conviction petition. Read the documents directly. Then, come back and answer one question in the comments. Should courts ever make exceptions to filing deadlines when constitutional claims are involved? Or are the rules, regardless of the consequences? If you found this analysis valuable, like the video, share it, subscribe to Audit the Case, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next document, filing, or court record we break down together.
Is not surprising from the court. It appears to be kind of rather straightforward under the law, what it says. And, I read through the 8th Circuit position as well. You heard the prosecution describe it too. It's pretty accurate about how they decided it. So look, what does it mean for Sharilla? It means she's out of options. It means unless there's some newly discovered evidence that proves she didn't do this, that proves she's completely innocent, that changes the whole game, I think her only option now is a chance at parole in 2037. Although you do wonder whether